Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Satya Sarma. I am a physician in internal medicine who has practiced in Arizona for about 30 years. I've also held leadership positions in a number of healthcare organizations here in Arizona as well as elsewhere. I have no financial interest to disclose. Also, the views expressed here today are entirely my own. Thank you for coming together today to discuss the critical topic of trust in healthcare. You've heard in the past sessions a little bit about how trust impacts our community's engagement with the healthcare system. I'm going to shift gears a tiny bit and review some of the historical context of this topic. And the hope here is that by doing so, we can it can help us understand a little bit better why we are where we are today and become more attuned to where to go from here. Some of the material I share with you today might invoke strong emotions. If you need to pause or step away, feel free to do so. It's a webinar, and honestly, no one will know. What I do ask is that when you're ready, do come back to this topic. Do your own research, your own thinking and deliberation, and consider whether those strong emotions signal that there's something important to learn here. What I am going to present are brief snippets in the history of healthcare as they connect to core aspects of our society's history. There is much, much more to learn for those interested. We can't cover this topic in 25 minutes of my speaking time. I hope these snippets help you make the connection between certainly the historical structures that impact trust in healthcare today, but also with how the way we structure society today will impact the trust people, especially those from racial and ethnic minorities, have in our healthcare systems now and in the future. So most of us know that the first slave ship docked on American shores in 1619. Fewer people are aware of how enslaved people were exploited to achieve some of the medical advancements we take for granted today. This painting is said to be the only known depiction of Lucy, Anarcha, and Betsy, three enslaved women purchased by Dr. Marion Sims. You can see him on the corner, on the right-hand corner of that painting. Hopefully you can see him, who is known as the father of gynecology. Dr. Sims and I went to the same medical school over a century apart. He invented many of the tools we use in routine gynecological exams, like the vaginal speculum that's in most physician offices, and developed many of the gynecological surgeries that we benefit from today. He did so by performing them on Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy, the three women portrayed here, without anesthesia. According to Dr. Sims, these women whom he owned willingly participated, quote unquote, willingly participated in this experimentation. In fact, this painting was created by Robert Thorne for the, quote, Great Moments in Medicine series. I wonder if we can pause here and just recall that today there is a massive disparity in the survival of Black women, Black mothers during and after childbirth that persists today. And what this episode might mean for our assumptions about what pain, who feels pain, and what pain indicates, what the thresholds of pain are in different peoples that we serve. Let's talk a little bit about immigration. It's often pointed out that we are a nation of immigrants. Our societal attitudes and policies related to immigration have also been reflected in our public health practices. In 1848, gold was discovered in California, leading to a spike in the demand for labor on the West Coast. Many immigrants, mostly males, came from China to fulfill this need, entering the US as laborers. When the boom went bust in 1855, American labor turned on these immigrants. The Chinese were not only seen as a threat to Americans getting jobs, but also seen as, quote, diseased and immoral. The so-called yellow peril. This cartoon originates from an Australian publication of the time, but it illustrates many of the premises of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which restricted immigration based on race. A few years later, when plague broke out across colonial-era Asia, it ultimately spread to Honolulu and then San Francisco. Public health officials claimed the disease was spread by and would primarily infect Chinese immigrants. They instituted discriminatory quarantines, required forcible vaccination, even though the vaccine for plague, recently developed at the time, had known potentially fatal side effects. At one point, when public health officials attempting to control plague entered Chinatown, there was a fire that broke out and actually burned down Chinatown in Honolulu. Ultimately, in San Francisco, it was the fact that the quarantines were impacting American businesses, restaurants, laundries weren't running, that caused a move by American businessmen to support, at that time they were really pretty much all men, support legal challenges against the Public Health Service. Eventually, the plague was controlled through limiting the rat population when it was identified that rats, not Chinese people, were the vector for the disease. I want you to pause for a moment and just reflect on some of the portrayals that occurred during this most recent pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, as you look at this cartoon. Now, Tuskegee is arguably the most documented case of medical racism in this country. It was called the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male by the U.S. Public Health Service and was conducted in Alabama between 1932 and all the way through 1972, 40 years. 400 Black men who had syphilis deliberately had treatment of the time withheld from them in order to understand what the natural progression of syphilis would be without treatment. 11 years into the study, penicillin became widely available and was known to cure syphilis. The US Public Health Service panel discussed this and yet decided to deliberately withhold penicillin from these men and continue the study. As a result, some of their wives and children were also infected, and many of them progressed to the secondary and tertiary stages of syphilis. It was not until the Associated Press published the details of the study in 1972 that a public outcry resulted in stopping the study. All the while, study participants were told the study was for their good. The quote you see here is from Ernest Herndon, the last survivor of the study, describing what he and other participants were told. Take a moment to connect that with vaccine hesitancy today. I want to point out that many of the serious effects of syphilis progression were well known at the time. This skull is from the Mater Museum in Philadelphia from 1899, as you can see. This skull illustrates the secondary gummatous stage where the disease quite literally eats into your bones. In the tertiary phases, syphilis can cause paralysis and dementia. Of course, the story of America begins with colonization. Attitudes towards Native American populations have surfaced in our health and coverage policies. Between 1970 and 1976, minority women of many ethnicities were forcibly sterilized to limit the overall population of minorities. In the Indian health system, 25 to 50% of Navajo women of childbearing age among other Native American women, including women as young as 19 years old, were forcibly sterilized at the Indian Health Service. Women who went in for headaches and tonsillectomies were permanently sterilized. They weren't informed, let alone, let's leave aside informed consent. They weren't even told what was happening to them. The justifications mentioned by proponents of this policy included concerns that without this forced sterilization, there would just be too many people needing care. And again, I want you to just pause and think how you connect this to trust in health systems today, where we have managed care organizations and other entities that are concerned about the cost of care. In the late 19th century, the US entered into wars to acquire control of several territories, and one of them was Puerto Rico. Now, Dr. Cornelius Rhoads was a Harvard-trained physician who initially went to Puerto Rico as a public health worker to study anemia. While he was there, a letter surfaced in which he wrote some rather stark things, including this quote from the letter: "I've killed 8 people and transplanted cancer in 13 more." His letter was leaked and caused outrage in Puerto Rico. He left Puerto Rico, but none of his views hurt his career on the mainland. Rhoads went on to become the head of Sloan Kettering and pioneered chemotherapy. In fact, he ended up on the cover of Time magazine. Well into the late 70s and 80s, a prestigious cancer research award was named in his honor. Not until a Puerto Rican researcher uncovered his past and published that letter on the then newly established internet did the AACR rename its prize in as late as 2003. Well, we've talked about some instances where the healthcare system engaged in really heinous treatment of ethnic and racial minorities, amongst others, I should say, in a way that I think we'd all agree destroys trust. But where did the idea of race, as we experience it in our system, arise? Much of this started during the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment was a movement in 18th century Europe, which gave rise to ideas like the idea that all men are created equal. It helped challenge monarchy and gave rise to democracies in America and Europe. Indeed, those same ideas fueled the abolitionist movement against slavery. But at the same time, during the Enlightenment, the concept of race and racial hierarchy also expanded. And it's important to realize that the science at the time embedded these concepts into healthcare through so-called scientific racism. And I say so-called because it's patently unscientific. In the Enlightenment, also called the Age of Reason, natural sciences expanded as a way for reasoning man to understand the world. As Enlightenment scientists tried to understand the diversity of human beings that Europeans at the time were encountering, they imported many biases into their theories about human beings. The illustration to the right shows how scientists classified human beings into 5 races. 5 different races were posited. And of course, there was this underlying assumption that there was one, quote, self-evidently superior race that was more ideal. In the Age of Reason, science gained greater and greater credibility as a way to explain the world. And this so-called science found its way back into social and political and intellectual, constructs of society. So, for example, Darwin's theory of natural selection, which he came up with by studying finches, as you all know, on the Galapagos Islands, ultimately was picked up by a man named Herbert Spencer in England. And he essentially transformed this or adopted it into a theory about society, the theory of social Darwinism. Herbert Spencer, in the mid to late 19th century, coined the phrase survival of the fittest. he argued that helping people who were, according to Spencer, quote, unfit to survive through social programs was bad for society. Spencer felt that by alleviating individual suffering, social programs held back progress for society as a whole. By the early 20th century, as genetics developed as a science, the idea of eugenics, the idea that having and promoting better gene pools was important for progress in society, had been adopted by movements like the progressive movement. These ideas led to support for the euthanasia and sterilization of many so-called less genetically desirable sets of people, including certain minority races, certain races, the disabled, babies with congenital deformities, etc. These views informed racist immigration and social policies, theories of infection, and made their way into public health policies and practices, as we've seen from the previous slides. But is race biological? As it turns out, as we've learned more about the human genome, it becomes difficult to support the concept of race as a biological entity. When you look at this chart, this graphic on the right, upper right-hand corner here of the slide, what you're seeing is the mapping of the human genome across different continents. And what you'll notice is each of these colors represent a different allele, a different genetic marker. And what you'll see is that there's really no one area where there's only one color. These colors are really spread across all the continents. There's no trademark allele that we've been able to find that distinguishes people based on their physical characteristics, such as skin color, let alone qualities and attributes such as intelligence, industry, or morality. Race, as we know it today, is a social, not a biological construct. And you can illustrate this at the individual level. This is an example, a case study of genetic variation between three scientists. At the top is James Watson, Craig, and below him are Craig Venter, and the third is Kim Seong-jin. They are all actually geneticists of some note, as you might know. The color bars here represent genes that were inherited from their parents. And what you find ultimately is that, Mr. Watson and Mr. Venter share one gene in common, but as it turns out, they each share two genes in common with Kim Seong-jin, whose parents are of Asian descent. So literally each of them has more in common with someone of a different so-called race than they do with each other, even though they would be classified as being in the same race. So what does this all mean to us today? One of my favorite American authors and philosophers, James Baldwin, once said, "People are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them." Even if an individual in front of you, someone you're seeking to help or serve, isn't aware of the history of racism in healthcare, that history, I contend, impacts the level of trust they have in the system that you represent, and therefore in you. Even if you aren't aware of that very history, even if you don't agree with it at all, that history is woven into the foundation of many of our institutional attitudes and practices today. It affects how you and I, as a part of the healthcare system, frame our work and how we're perceived. It's unavoidable that it does so. Therefore, as healthcare practitioners, we need to stop asking the question, "Why don't you trust me?" and start answering this question from those we serve. Why should I trust you? And with that, I'll pause. Perhaps we'll have time for a few questions. Thank you for listening.
If anyone has any questions, you could put it in the chat. I thought this was remarkable, outstanding presentation. We're getting a comment here. I did have a question. So when you demonstrated, when you showed the slide and demonstrated the commonality between the scientists, what initiated that study? I mean, how did they come across those commonalities?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, really, one of the huge steps in genetics has been the sequencing of the human genome. And I think this is a great example for where, you know, these geneticists actually ran their own genome just to sort of illustrate what they were seeing,
I see.
which is that the science itself is showing us that those premises don't hold water. Yeah, I think this is a great case study of it that you can show in large populations as well, now that we're actually collecting genetic information from across the world.
Right, and I think more attempt for some similarity, you know, to discuss similarities would be needed in order to have that mind shift, you know.
Well, you know what
And
I like to say, Jeanette, is, I mean, to me, the science is very clear. There's no such human color as white. That's how I would put it. It doesn't exist. It's a social
yeah,
construct. It has its own historical background. And the question is, what do we want to live with going forward? What knowledge base do we want to build our systems on today? I think that's you know, that's the question I'd like for, you know, myself, my generation, and certainly the generations after me to be thinking about.
excellent. We have in the chat. I don't know if you see it.
Yes. Let me see if I can pull these
So
out.
your email address, and I think when you share your slides with us, it will have that information on it too. But if you could put in the chat, and I just want everybody to know that Dr. Sarma has a hard stop at 3 o'clock. So I just want to get through some of these questions, and I want to thank everybody and thank Dr. Sarma for an amazing presentation. Did you want to continue to look at the comments and questions?
Yes, I thank you all for the feedback. And I've put my my email in the chat. I'm very happy to correspond with you. And that's my personal email. You're welcome to email me there, or the one that's on the presentation. Yes, I came across Dr. Taylor, I think you asked about how often do medical students acknowledge the racism that has been implied in treatment. I've got to tell you an interesting story. I did not come across any of this information in medical school. I did not hear about Tuskegee, except honestly, quite accidentally. I was part of a discussion group during residency that met met on weekends when we were doing electives. There was no requirement for us to learn this history, even as medical students. And I think this is such a big gap. You know, think about your own life. If someone does something to lose your trust and then they don't even acknowledge it, how does that impact your relationship with them and your ability to trust them? I'm not saying everything in life can be, you know, translated into what does it do to the individual, but take that analogy. I think it's fitting for where we are in healthcare. We do need to understand techniques, and we do need to understand, you know, how to bring services to people. We need to understand how to address social determinants. I'm not saying any of that is not really important work, but the context, the grounding of it, I think is really, really foundational if we're truly talking about building trust. We have to tell the truth to be trusted. And that includes telling the truths that we don't like talking about. So to your question, I think this ought to be part of the curriculum of anyone entering healthcare. We won't get to where we need to be without the awareness and without us being able to absorb this information and really make something from it that takes us in a better direction. And Paula says, I think it aligns with the fact that many patients trust or feel comfortable having a clinician that looks like them. Great point. And there's really good research to support exactly what you said there. And Paula, you also talk about Henrietta Lacks. Yes.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, one of the things I discovered when I started researching it is there's no end to the number of stories you can find that are really disturbing. And, you know, Henrietta Lacks' story, if you have not read the book, you should. It's really important for us to understand that story. And of course, there's been some progression on that story today, but you know, we owe a huge, we in the healthcare system need to understand that we carry this burden of history. Dr. Taylor, there are HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, medical schools that present treatment to African-American patients as well as treatment to people globally. Yes. You know, and I think, you know, one of the things I've been working on recently is with the Arizona Public Health Association. And, you know, I have to give a lot of credit to the group of people who volunteer there, that we've been thinking about these kinds of issues and been talking about these kinds of issues. What do we do to actually bring those perspectives that are the people we serve have to be represented in how we actually define and approach a care? How do we bring those voices to power, right? How do we actually truly understand and connect with people? And what does it take for us to become humble enough to be able to do that? I think that's a really great point, Dr. Taylor. Well, I know I had a very short time with this group. I really compressed. I'm glad we were able to compress a good conversation into that, 30 minutes we had together. I'm very, very open to connections, to having more conversation, to sharing this information, and more. There's I'm very, very open to any of you connecting with me. I'll send the slides to you, Janet, and I look forward to making some connections here.
Thank you so very much. Really appreciate you and your knowledge and this wonderful presentation. I just want to remind everybody, it's important that you fill out your evaluation so we can give all of our presenters some feedback on their presentation, and also collect that for future use in terms of future presenters and workshops and things like that. So I do want to encourage you. You'll get an email with the evaluation, and so please complete that. And thanks again. And Dr. Sarma, I will definitely be circling back with you and talking about some other things that we can do together. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you for all your participation. Have a wonderful rest of the day.